Debunked. I'm going to debunk that argument. And I've got MP, aka Nate. He's my only guest today so far. So we're going to see how this goes. Okay, get our debunk on. Peter shared this video with me last week. And me and Peter were good buddies. And we're on totally opposite sides. And I really like intelligent design, and he really likes evolution and all that stuff, which are not necessarily opposites. There are some intelligent design proponents who believe in universal common descent, like Mike Behe, who is a very prominent intelligent design proponent. But there are some. I personally don't really accept a lot of the evolution narrative. Some of it I do, but a lot of it I don't. So anyways, in this particular video, it goes after one of my favorite arguments for design, which is the argument from DNA. Or as this particular video puts it, the DNA as a language argument. Yeah, and you know what? Actually, I had it all queued up, and I queued up the wrong video, Nate.
Oh man, you talked it up and everything. I was waiting. I was like, okay, we're gonna get this thing debunked tonight.
I know, right? What the heck's wrong with me? That's okay.
Damn, man. Even though we had the music and everything, I'm like, intelligent design. I'm like singing in the background, waiting for it.
I know. So I'm gonna have to find another way to do this. But what do you think about? Where do you stand, MP? First of all, I don't even know which.
I just want to be very clear. I am an evolutionist. I believe evolution it's the best explanation that we have. Don't get me wrong. I am sympathetic to people like Mike Behe and Stephen Miller, the intelligent design proponents. But I think after the Dover trial, Stephen Meyer. Yes, yeah. I'm sorry, Stephen Meyer. I think Ken Miller, for instance, he destroyed Mike Behe's argument within the Dover trial, and this was actually, it's hard for me, someone who's actually read the case of the Dover trial, and I actually, watched the documentary also, and I've read the opinion, I should say, and it's interesting to me because that was a conservative judge who looked at both sides, and he came out to say that more or less that evolution was science, and and intelligent design was more a religious aspect. So, we can talk about some of the components of evolution I think aren't controversial, like, descent with modification and things of that nature. But I think the grander scheme of evolution may be something harder to prove on this call. So, we'll take it step by step.
Okay. Well, thanks for buying me some time there. I think I got the video queued up. But, okay, so you're really on the evolution side. See, I don't even like presenting it as evolution versus intelligent design. I like it's more like the materialist view, or naturalism versus intelligent design. The idea that everything originated without mind versus some of these things mind was necessary to produce. So for example, DNA. Now, have you heard about the DNA argument? Are you familiar with that argument much?
No, I have heard some DNA arguments, so some analogies, like, it's computer code, but I'm not as familiar with it as I should. So if you want to go over it, it'll be good for me and for the audience.
Okay. Well, I posted a link to the video in a couple of different places, and on the YouTube, on this YouTube video, I posted a link to it, I believe, in the description. If not, I will later. But here's a clip where the guy actually presents a very simple syllogistic version of the argument. So I'm going to play that right now.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what? I'm going to do something even cooler. I'm going to display not the video, but a screenshot of him. And boom, there it is from the video, and that's so cool. All right, so now here's the clip.
Spaghetti monster.
What? Oh yeah. Okay. And we are super professionals.
Follows. Language is a product of a mind. DNA is a language. Therefore, DNA is a product of a mind.
All right. That was pretty simple, right? You heard it, right?
Yes.
Okay. So language comes from a mind. DNA is a language. Therefore, DNA came from a mind. I must feel like that's oversimplifying it. But I don't really see anything wrong with the description, though. I don't know. Your thoughts?
I don't know. I don't. I
Logically
understand
valid,
people
I guess.
say DNA is a language, but I don't know. I don't see it as. It's like you know how they put certain molecules together, and certain molecules you can build different structures. I wouldn't say atoms are a language. You know, it's a description of certain components, and when you put these components together, they create a larger scheme. You know, so just like, and language is the same thing, but I wouldn't consider atoms, which creates DNA is created full of atoms. Matter of fact, the same atoms in particular repeats, but I wouldn't call the atoms within DNA a code for the code. You know what I mean?
Okay, so for you, the argument in principle is okay. It's just, what is language? We have to establish the premise that DNA is a language, and that's the crux of it. Is that about
Yeah,
right?
yeah, because for instance, DNA, the A, what is it, ATCG, right? The four letters, and they come together in these particular repeats, and you get the DNA code, the code. But the DNA is actually even made up of smaller features, and I'm going all the way to the base, which are atoms, long chains of hydrogen, carbon, so forth and so forth. And they're all in the same sequences. Like, you know, when you get a T for for DNA, that T represents a certain amount of atoms distributed in a certain way. So it seems like the true code, if we're talking about it as a code, would be the atoms themselves, because the atoms, you have to have a specific set of atoms in a specific way to get the T to make DNA. But now I won't think anybody would consider an atom to be, or the atomic periodic table of elements to be a code. You know, so that's kind of why I'm not understanding the analogy.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So I think the idea. Well, I don't think he really. In this video, I don't think he even really tackles the question of whether or not DNA is actual code, or at least he doesn't do a very thorough job. But let's just look at his definitions first of all. His claim is that there's an equivocation fallacy in the argument, the syllogistic argument he presented, where you're using two different definitions of language. So let's hear him explain that.
During premise 1 and 3, they are using a communicational definition of the word language, which is a method of communication in which intended information is conveyed from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and semiotic rules. But during premise 2, they are using a programming definition of the word language, which is a set of rules that instruct elements on how to function and behave. Now,
okay. So these two definitions, in one of them, it's a message shared between different entities or groups, and let me play you the clip where he explains why these two definitions are different.
the main difference between them is that the communicational definition necessitates that a mind receive, interpret, and decipher information, and thus it necessarily infers intelligence.
Okay, so that's the big problem that I have. It sounds like the guy is saying that just because the definition says the word entity in it, that means mind. But I don't understand how he comes to that conclusion, because an entity could be many different things. It could be something that's conscious. It could be something that's unconscious. So
That's a good point. Can you rewind it real quick? I just wanted to hear that again.
yeah, sure. Let me cue that back up. Just the point about what the difference is between the two definitions. We'll play that again. Okay, so the main definition.
Sorry, yes.
The main difference between these definitions is right here.
The main difference between them is that the communicational definition necessitates that a mind receive, interpret, and decipher information, and thus it necessarily infers intelligence.
Okay, so if I can read that definition again that he's using, it says, well, it's communicational language, a method of communication in which intended information is conveyed from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and semiotic rules. So he says that this definition necessitates a mind. I'm not sure where he's getting that. Except maybe
because a mind would be the one to interpret the message. Like you couldn't have a message without mind. Number one, a mind would have to send the message, and another mind would have to be able to interpret a message. If you just have some letters out there that no one can interpret, it's not a message.
Yeah, but we have systems without a mind that interpret messages. I think that's. I mean, computers. They interact with each other. The internet is a giant example of that. So I don't really buy that premise that in order for there to be a message that is translated or communicated or exchanged, you have to have conscious entities exchanging that message and interpreting it.
But isn't he talking about the context of the word language? Because he's saying it's almost like the word strike. If I say strike, in one context that can mean one thing, in another context can mean another thing. If I could talk about a strike in baseball, a strike in bowling, or a labor strike. And similarly, I think with language you do have that too. You have the language of communication, symbols that put together that aggregate can communicate a message. And that, I think, is what he's saying, institutes a mind. But then you have another type of language, and that's the second definition I think he was employing, to saying that there's a different context. And by switching the context, then you have a bad analogy. Did I just explain that very, very poorly? You freeze up on me? Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, you looking at the chat?
No.
Yeah, I said, give me 1 second, keep talking. Okay, yeah, I had to step away.
I'm sorry, I'm on my phone.
1 second. Yeah. We'll get better at coordinating these things. We'll get it. But so I don't even remember what we were saying. I didn't hear some of what you were saying, but I'll let you have the last word on that part of it.
No, I was just saying simply it's about context. Words have different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think language is a word that has two different contexts. And just like the word strike, if I say strike, unless I give you more, you don't know the definition. I could say you strike at a baseball game, or strike at a bowling alley, or strike at a labor meeting, labor strike. So context, and I think that's what he's saying. This is an elaborate video just to say the word language has two different contexts. And he believes that when you say DNA as a language, you're using it in the wrong context, the word language.
Okay, but the difference that he points out is that one definition necessitates a mind, and I don't think that that's necessarily true. I don't think that definition that he himself is citing necessitates mind just because it's an exchange of messages between more than one entity. I don't think an entity has to be a conscious entity. I think it could be some automated system or something, like computers or whatever. I think DNA is such an entity, actually. But he says something else that I mean, up to this point, I was watching the video and like, okay, yeah, sorta, not really, But at this part of the video that I'm about to play, I totally was like, what? No. So here we go.
Oh, hold on. Before you go on to the next part of the video,
okay.
The two definitions that he used for language.
Mm-hmm.
Which one do you believe describes DNA better? The one to communicate or the second definition? Because it seems like the second definition describes DNA better than the first definition. If you want, you can listen to them again, because I think that point should be made.
Okay, well, let's listen to them again then. Let me cue that up. Let's do that again. All right, here we go. Here's the two definitions.
During premise 1 and 3, they are using a communicational definition of the word language, which is a method of communication in which intended information is conveyed from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and semiotic rules. But during premise 2, they are using a programming definition of the word language, which is a set of rules that instruct elements on how to function and behave. Now, granted,
you can stop it.
Yeah.
So DNA seems to fit the second definition a lot better than the first.
I think it fits both. I think it fits both definitions, in my opinion. There is communication between different entities. There's a communication channel, and the information itself is a code. It's a set of rules. It's it defines different things, disparate physical states. So I think in my opinion, it fits both definitions. It's kind of hard for me to say which one I think it fits, or which one fits better.
You went very low, but that's fair enough. I was able to hear you, but you're very low. There you go, you're back.
I'm back. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I think it fits both definitions pretty well. It's a language, quote unquote, in the sense that you have different entities within the gene expression system that are communicating with each other across a communication channel. But the information itself is like a code that provides instructions and descriptions, and it represents disparate physical states. So I think, in my opinion, it sounds like DNA fits both definitions.
Okay, I'd even go with that. Let's say this. Let's say it does fit both, and let's see where his argument goes to see if he can narrow it to one versus the other.
Okay. Now, here's where I think he really gets something just really, really wrong.
To put it more clearly, unlike English, math, and this video, DNA code isn't interpreted by anything.
Okay, so this is like the apex of this particular part of the video, the first half of the video, where he's saying that DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. I just don't know how he can say that. I mean, if you know anything about DNA, you know that it is interpreted by the ribosome. It's the ribosome that interprets the DNA message and translates it into strings of amino acids.
Well, is it? Well, I'd ask this: is the ribosome DNA is an acid? Is the ribosome and the DNA, when it works together, is it a chemical process where particular chemicals, in the DNA trigger a particular process in the ribosome, and that's how the interpretation method happens. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, the thing is, what's it called? See, I'm not a technical expert, but I do read about it. There are RNA molecules that adapt the codons to an amino acid, but the thing about it is that it's arbitrary. There's no direct affinity between base pair codons and the amino acids that they represent. It's only through the intermediary translating apparatus of the ribosome that you get one from the other. So there's no direct relationship, there's no direct affinity whatsoever. It's only through this intermediary that we have meaning, so to speak, because it's translated. So I think it's 1,000% wrong, this claim that DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. It's clearly interpreted by the ribosome. The code is interpreted by the intermediary translation apparatus of the ribosome.
Right, hold on, just to be clear. All right, let's say I put gasoline and take a match. I can say that the fire is interpreting the gasoline, but the reaction, if I just put the fire onto the gasoline and it causes, and it ignites the gasoline, that is that's a chemical reaction. I don't think there's any interpretation. It seems like with DNA, if I have T, A, G, whatever, those markers, that's the reason why they have those 4 markers, are just reacting to the ribosome to make the other proteins and what so have you. So are you saying there's something more than this chemical reaction? Is there something different than that?
Yeah, because it's not the chemical properties of the system. It's not the chemical properties of the code that results in the physical states. Like in gasoline or chemistry, it's the physical properties of each constituent part interacting directly with each other. Like if there's not that intermediary, then you're not going to get an amino acid from the codons. These are arbitrarily assigned within the machinery of the ribosome.
Well, let's see what he says, because I am confused in that fact, because it seems like DNA is an acid with these base pairs A, T, C, G. When they hit, something different will happen. When the T hits, then the C, But maybe I might be wrong. Let's see what he says.
Okay, so DNA isn't interpreted by anything. See, I mean, I kind of understand where you're coming from, because I think there's a causal chain of events, a chain of causality, but I don't. I think within that there's interpretation, and you have to understand that a translator is there's an element of being arbitrary to it. There's no direct physical reason why one thing will turn into the other. There's a machinery that arbitrarily assigns these things. Like we arbitrarily assign meaning to vowels and consonants and strings of these signal components. There's no physical reason why they have to mean anything.
But
so
hold on,
an intermediary translator.
Maybe and this may be my ignorance, so please excuse me if the question doesn't come off as intelligent, but my understanding of the process of DNA and ribosomes and these type of things is that DNA has these base pairs, and when these base pairs goes through this process, they have chemical markers, and those chemical markers trigger certain reactions. So if you have a T, an A, and a G, that's going to be different than if it was a G, an A, and a T, because of the chemical markers, for instance. So my question to you is that you're saying that there's something in between that, some interpretation that has to go on. I'm saying that I don't see the interpretation, because if it's a T, I'm assuming the same thing is going to happen as with every other T. But I believe it seems the combinations in which the T, the A's, the G's occur that causes the differences. So are you saying that that's not the case, or are you saying that is the case?
I'm saying that it's not the case that these codons necessarily code for the amino acid that we observe them to code for. The RNA molecule that translates the codon from whatever the sequence is to an amino acid, the amino acid on the other side of that, it could be any amino acid. It's totally arbitrary. It's just not the way that the ribosome is built. The ribosome is built arbitrarily to assign certain codons to certain amino acids. There's no physical reason why it had to be built that way, though.
So is it random? Are you saying that the outcome is random?
I'm not saying it's random. I think the origin of that system is unknown, but we don't know of any physical necessity why an amino acid was assigned to certain codons.
Oh, okay. I think I understand what you're saying now. All right.
Yeah, so there's no, like, in nature, like, we put these things together, like, the codons by themselves, they're not going to just automatically turn into these amino acids. You have to have that translation apparatus in between there to get that to happen. So anyways, you have another point or anything?
No.
Okay.
I was going to say on to the video, because I want to hear what he says about this, because this is an interesting point.
Yeah, and you know what? Unfortunately, he doesn't really go into it very much further. He just kind of, and everybody can watch the video for themselves, but it's just kind of like DNA isn't interpreted by anything. But I think it's very clearly the case that it is interpreted by the ribosome. And yes, I'm skipping the part where DNA, it's transcribed or whatever to the messenger RNA, and then that goes into the ribosome or whatever. I'm not getting too technical here. I can't get super technical, but I've read enough where I understand that the guy is totally wrong when he's saying that DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. It's interpreted in the ribosome. So he kind of moves on from that argument, and then he goes into natural selection.
The two, and this is the crux of the confusion, is that computer code is written by an intelligent designer, that being a human, while DNA code is written by natural selection, that being nature unconsciously determining which codes remain in the gene pool. Therefore, if one accepts natural selection, then, by extension, they accept that DNA code is determined by natural processes. They accept that, contrary to Ham's assertion, programming language can, and does, come from natural, unconscious processes.
Okay, so what he's doing is he's offering an alternative mechanism to produce language or code. Well, I don't even know if he's really saying code. Well, he kind of is. He's talking about computer code and comparing it with DNA. I guess he's kind of saying that that is a better comparison. So he's saying that natural selection is the cause. That's the explanation for the origin of DNA code. But he assumes the mechanism without actually arguing for it. I think he's taking a lot for granted there. I don't see how you can state a conclusion with such confidence and yet not bother to argue for it at all.
But I think he's under the assumption of that microevolution has been proven, or people accept it. Like, for instance, do you accept the concept of microevolution?
Microevolution, sure.
And if you just simply take that, like, for instance, I usually use the DNA example of you ever saw Maury Povich, the "You Are Not the Father," those episodes.
No, I haven't really seen that, but
Well, not seen them, but just heard of that the
yeah,
paternity test
yeah,
where the
sort of.
guys. Yeah, but so you would agree? Let's say if you have two parents, they when they have a child, that child is not a genetic clone of the parents, right? That child is different in some way, right?
Sure.
And it could be taller, it could be shorter. It's going to go. It's not going to be a genetic clone. It's going to look different than their parents. Just it may be the simplest of ways: longer nose, bluer eyes, taller, shorter, whatever those differences are. And those differences you can see within the DNA. But now, if we were to take a paternity test with me versus you and your parents, that test would be able to determine that you're their child and I'm not related to you, right? That test would easily be able to determine that, right?
Yeah.
And that's because your DNA is more closely to your parents than mine is to your parents. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, but so natural selection would be that effect if you're having offspring that are just slightly different. And the difference is, let's say, for instance, strength can help you survive in an environment, then those who are survive are just those who are more adapted for that environment, giving you the microevolution.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't deny that um, descent with modification occurs to some extent. I think the question, as far as evolution and natural selection, is how far can we extrapolate from those things that we observe, from the evolution that we observe. That's where I would impose some limits, like maybe put the brakes on. I think maybe we're taking this a little farther than warranted. But in as far as this video, though, we're talking about the origin of DNA. Really, I mean, once the system exists, maybe it can evolve. Who knows?
Yeah, that's
But
why I think this is
what he's
confusing.
saying is natural selection can program it in the first place. I think he's kind of changed the argument a little bit here. We're not talking about the evolution of an already existing system. We're talking about where to come from.
That's because I think you guys are looking at it two different ways. You're looking at it from a bottom up approach in the sense of you're saying that, this has to come from a designer and looking at it from that way, where he's looking at it from, okay, let's look at the evidence that we have now. We know things change. We know about modification. These are the experiments in the lab, and we can extrapolate back and say, okay, the organisms before us had to go through the same process. This descent with modification, if you go back a million years, what would things look like? So that's what I think the problem is. He's looking at it coming from, this is what we know now. Let's extrapolate back. Where you're going from, what do we know from back then, the first cell, moving forward.
Yeah, but I think that's the original question, though. He takes on Lee Strobel and someone else in this video, some other people I don't really pay attention to, and their argument is that the origin of the system to begin with has to be some kind of an intelligent cause. Not that I would accept either of his examples as representatives of the intelligent design movement, but the argument he's responding to is addressing the origin of the system. And I don't think he's made an argument about the origin of the system, yet he's claiming to have answered the argument he's responding to. The evolution of the system is different from the origin of the system. It's a question of the origin of the system, yet he's made an argument about the evolution of the system. Maybe that's a simpler way to put it.
No, you're right, but I think he's addressing the point that DNA is not a code because this code is programmed through natural processes. This code is descent with modification, as we talked about before. You're going to look different than your parents. Your kids are going to look different from you. If all the successive generations, the children are taller, then at the end you may have beings that look totally different from the generations 100 years ago. And I think that's what he's saying. That's his point. His point is the programmer is not a mind, because we see the programmer. We see the program every
Well,
day.
sure.
When you have this statement modification, that's the programmer.
Yeah, but notice what he did, though, if that's the case. If that's what the argument is, he's no longer arguing that it's not a language or that it's not a code. Now he's conceding the point that it's a code, but he's instead arguing that nature can do it, though. That nature can program it. So it's almost like, if that's what he's arguing, it's almost like he's conceded the argument.
Well, don't forget,
he's just saying, because the argument, let's be very clear, his argument is that DNA is not language, DNA is not code. So by shifting to an argument about where the code came from, he's conceding the original argument. It's just he's moved on to a different one.
Well, remember when he said there was two definitions of language, and he was saying he was already making the argument for context. Then he employed the second definition, and me and you said, well, we weren't sure which one. You said both of them seemed to fit, and I said the second one seemed to fit. But now, if you take his second definition of what language was, and apply it to this particular situation, that language is just a set of principles that continually go more or less mindlessly, and then you take that definition and assume it to natural selection, which we all agree is true, then I think the second definition of language and this process of natural selection gives you a consistent view of what he's talking about. The second definition of language, where you don't have to have a mind, it's just a set of principles like we putting gasoline on a flame. And then natural selection being that process that substitutes with the second definition of language. So it seems to be consistent if you use his definition for language with natural selection.
Yeah, I just keep coming back to the point that the argument he's responding to is about the origin of it, though.
But I might be able to help with a couple things, though.
Okay, go ahead, chime in.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you guys were watching the outside chat.
I've been juggling a couple of things.
Yeah, so I was just trying to say, you were talking about earlier that the ribosome, doesn't have to recognize the codon to any particular amino acid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing is that the amino acid is actually attached to the transfer RNA by different peptidyl transferases.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually based on the specific affinities of the different chemicals involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there actually is specific chemical affinities involved in attaching to a specific tRNA a specific amino acid, and then you have the affinity of a specific tRNA anticodon of the tRNA to the specific codon of the RNA, messenger RNA. So it's definitely down to the specific nature of the chemicals involved that leads to the actual production of the final product.
Yeah, well, but there has to be that intermediary. The code, it doesn't mean anything without that intermediary translation apparatus in the ribosome.
Except that the ribosome doesn't care about what any of it says.
Sure.
Right? The ribosome recognizes the amount of space in between a codon and an anticodon, which is dictated by the affinity of the two to one another, right? And so when they can get close enough to each other because they have a sufficiently high affinity, then the ribosome reacts and moves the amino acid onto the chain, right? So, but it doesn't actually know what those codons and anticodons are. It doesn't know what any of the RNA is. It just recognizes, are these two things close enough together or not?
Right, but it wouldn't you say it's translating the DNA? Well, I know it's not technically the DNA, but essentially that DNA code gets translated via the ribosome.
Yes, that's the term that's used.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, how is it different from any other translation?
Specifically because the ribosome doesn't know what it's doing.
Well, neither does a computer.
A computer
you have a JPEG file, the code is translated to colors on your display.
Right. Accepting
Nobody
that.
knows what's happening.
I'm sorry?
Computer doesn't know what's happening. It's just built that way.
Right, but you're missing the really key thing here, right? So this is like saying that I don't know, like a mousetrap is translating live mice into dead mice, right? It's like this is not. It's not the computer, right? Is taking this specific bit of information, recognizing that it's this bit of information and not that bit of information, and then doing some specific operation on this bit of information that it wouldn't have done on that bit of information. But the ribosome doesn't do that. It just closes the gate when it can. That's it.
I don't think the dead mouse thing works. We're talking about disparate states. We're talking
There's
about
two states. It closes or it doesn't close. Right? It either transfers the amino acid or it doesn't.
the mouse isn't translated to anything. The mouse
It's translated
changes,
from being alive to dead.
It's changing its own physical state. The DNA actually, it's interpreted as something totally disparate, a totally different physical entity.
The ribosome doesn't do that.
So the ribosome doesn't convert or translate or interpret
The ribosome
codons into amino acids.
The ribosome reacts to the presence of a sufficiently high affinity between codon and anticodon in the same way that a mousetrap reacts to a sufficiently low weight.
Well, I understand that it works physically somehow. There are physical processes involved, but it's still
so it's like
translation that takes place.
So it's like
the same way a computer does it.
The mousetrap doesn't know if the weight is off because the cheese was removed, or by a mouse, or by a finger, or by the wind, or by vibration. It doesn't know if it had cheese on it, or peanut butter, or whatever else, right? It doesn't know anything about anything except how much weight is on there right now. And if it's gone, it closes. And in the same way, the ribosome only recognizes the amount of force being put upon it by the codon and anticodon of the tRNA.
Yeah, but it doesn't only do that. It converts the codons into
That's what happens when... I'm sorry, what?
It converts the codons into amino acids.
No, it doesn't.
What does it do?
So the anticodon, right, is carrying the amino acid, right? And when the right tRNA enters, it can get close enough to the codon that the ribosome is able to close. And when it closes, it pushes the amino acid onto the growing chain of the protein.
Right. So
but
it's
it doesn't,
converting it into a string of amino acids.
It's performing chemistry, right? But it doesn't know the difference.
Same thing with a computer. It's performing physical interactions.
Except that, again, the computer is programmed specifically to recognize one bit versus another and do a certain task to one bit that it wouldn't do to the other bit, right? And do this programmatically. But the ribosome only recognizes the one thing, and it's always the same thing, regardless of which pair of codon and anticodon is present, right? So it doesn't know the difference between the codon anticodon pair for one amino acid versus another versus another versus another, right? It only recognizes what's that separation, what's that force between the two, right? And if it hits the right state, it closes, and it does that little bit of chemistry that it's made for, that it does, right? That's what the shape of the ribozymes do, right? And it transfers that amino acid off. But to say that it's
Mhm.
interpreting it would require that it has the capacity to recognize the difference between the different things that it could possibly hold, so that it recognizes the difference between one codon-anticodon pair, right? That is the correct codon-anticodon pair, and another correct codon-anticodon pair. You would almost be better off saying
So
that the tRNA interprets the codon than the ribosome interprets the codon, because it's doing more recognition. If you're going to say something recognizes something else, the anticodon recognizes the codon.
okay, well, translation takes place here.
There's a bit of chemistry that, for convenience,
Well,
is referred
it's-
to as translation.
Chemical translation, which is, it sounds to me, it's indistinguishable from, maybe not indistinguishable. Maybe it's distinguishable in how exactly it works, but it's doing the same thing. It's taking signal components and they're being converted into separate physical states or disparate physical states.
Yes, but the thing that's doing that, my point is just with the reference to the ribosome, right? Saying that the ribosome is interpreting things or recognizing things or whatever else, right, is to misunderstand what the ribosome does and how it does it.
Okay, so, well, let's just say that system then. Okay, expression, gene expression. During the process of gene expression, that code is converted into disparate physical states.
Yes, following the chemistry of all of the constituent parts.
Right, okay. So, then I don't see how this guy is right to say that DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. I think
Well,
he's flat out wrong.
My impression...
I mean, if it can't be interpreted, then what good is it?
Well, it's sort of like saying, to say that something is interpreted, I feel requires some degree of understanding, right? You wouldn't say that the landscape interprets rainfall to get it to the right watershed, right? It just flows downhill. There's no interpretation there. That's just the way physics works, right?
Right.
And
So
in the same way, there's no understanding in the process of transcription and translation. That's just the way chemistry works.
there's no understanding in a computer either when it converts a JPEG into a visual representation of the JPEG.
Well, that depends on how you're defining understanding. To the extent that you want to define understanding in such a way that there is no understanding in the computer, what that computer is doing does not constitute language in the sense of communication.
So signal components are not transmitted across a communication channel where they're interpreted.
Yeah, so
Just some kind of
again,
meeting.
when you're talking about language style communication, the receiver needs to have something new at the end of it, right? So one of the examples that I've read of this is that if I tell you something that you already know, I haven't communicated anything to you. It's necessary that there is new information that you receive and have some capacity to act on. If you don't understand that the thing that I've told you is the same as everything else you've gotten, then it is new information, because you can't distinguish the repeated information that you already have, right? That I just repeated to you from the information that you already had. If there's no understanding, if there is understanding, and this is what distinguishes communication, then when you get that information you already have, you don't learn anything, and that's why that distinction's made in that specific conception of communication and information theory. And that's also why it's distinguished from the information theory as is relevant to chemistry and physics.
Okay, so you think that it's different somehow.
I think it's different in the way that I just said.
So you don't think that when the genetic information is transmitted through the process of gene expression, when it comes out on the other end as a string of amino acids, you don't think that that's something new?
I don't think that anything has been communicated in that sense of communication.
Well,
Which is, I believe, the entire point of the video, that this is all.
you don't think anything has been communicated even though there's a new physical state that results from it?
Well, there's a new physical state that results from rainfall. And it
that's
requires
a different question
no, it's the
translation.
same question. No, it's the same question, right? Because you have a pre-existing physical state, or set of physical states, right, that work with this oncoming rainfall to then process it into a particular watershed, where you then have a new state of this new amount of water in that watershed. So you have a new state coming about from an interaction between some new information of falling rain with pre-existing physical states. That's what is happening with DNA in that sense. You have pre-existing physical states of the system of transcription and translation, and you have the new information, quote unquote, of the transcribed regions that are then resulting in a new state of this protein, right? But there's no understanding, there's no communication in the sense of communication theory of information. There's information in the sense of physical information theory, but that's, again, distinct and separate.
Well, but I think we have to ask, what is quote-unquote new information? Is it just that I didn't know about it in my mind, or is it that it results in a physical state that didn't previously exist, and are these things even actually different?
Well, again, in the communication theory of information, right, it's the first one, and in the physical information theory, it's the second, right? But if you're trying to argue that DNA is a language, you really need it to be that first one. But again, that requires understanding, and that's, see, this is where that problem is that again I believe was made fairly clear in the video.
See, I would think that the physical state, I don't think that the distinction is actually that clear. I kind of think that the physical state trumps anything about minds or understanding. That seems vague to me. In any case, it results in a new state that didn't previously exist. I think the differences are tangential and not very meaningful.
Well, except that, again, I feel like you're responding to a video where the video is trying to make a particular semantic point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're ignoring precisely the semantic point they're trying to make and saying that that point is just semantics. Well, the entire point of the video is semantics. So dismissing it as simply semantics is, I think, kind of missing the point.
I don't think I'm dismissing it necessarily as semantics. I'm dismissing it because he says DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. I think it clearly is.
It's not interpreted in the way that interpretation is meant in communication theory of information. Again, this is the semantics of it, right?
So, like, Shannon information theory only deals with conscious systems, then?
Well, no. So information theory is the superset that includes, communication theory of information, physical theory of information, various other things. Shannon information, right, is sort of a different thing. It's important to understand that, like, Shannon was extremely important in information theory in all branches of information theory, right? Including communication theory of information. But Shannon information has a very particular meaning, right? That does have applications in the communication theory of information as well as in the physical theory of information. So if you just say Shannon information, right, I think you're not actually getting to the distinction between the two sets.
So there's a definition, or there's a communication theory that deals exclusively with minds, language information, or language information theory, or what would you call that?
Well, it's the communication theory of information.
Communication theory of information.
Or mathematical theory of communication, sometimes.
And that deals with exclusively minds.
It deals with information sources being transmitted to receivers and interpreters.
Okay.
This can then be this can then be applied in certain ways to deal with communication, as it were, between computer systems, wherein you have some type of programmatic interpretation of information, which is especially important when you're trying to distinguish between signal and noise, for instance. Where basically you're trying to make sure that when computer 1 receives from computer 2 some data, right, you need to be able to verify that you've gotten the right data. Okay. And so often that they'll have some redundancy in the data, so that if everything is received properly, right, then the interpreter can then actually look at these two things, make sure they're the same, and then say that yes, indeed, this has been received appropriately. And so when you're doing that kind of thing, then it comes down to communication theory. But that's not really the same thing as the information theory, which is more generic than that.
Okay, well, I don't really see the distinction, or why DNA, you think it doesn't communicate anything.
Well, what is it communicating to?
Well, I was saying the ribosome, but you're saying specifically the RNA, the tRNAs. What was it? tRNAs.
And what is it communicating to the tRNA?
You mean what are the signal components that it's communicating?
What is the message that the tRNA receives from the RNA?
What is the message? It's it's the string of it's the gene, or I'm not really sure what you're looking for.
The tRNA doesn't receive anything from any of the other codons. It only receives that one codon, and it doesn't actually receive any information. It just binds with the codon.
Well, but no. See, now you can say the same thing about a computer, though. That it doesn't actually do anything. That because it physically works somehow, it's not actually receiving any information.
So here's the really important thing with a computer is that computers tend to have data storage, right? Like even the most basic computer, like even the Babbage machines, right? The purely analog computers, they had data storage. Okay, and so when you had input to them, it wasn't simply taking a single bit of physical activity and giving a single output. It was actually storing successive physical inputs, right? And then acting on the entirety of the physical input, right? Not just one at a time. It's not simply gear 1 turns, so gear 2 turns. It's everything goes in, everything is interpreted as the whole, right? And then based on that whole, some particular activity is performed, some particular output is produced, and this is something that is common to all computers, actually, right? I mean, it's even common to a calculator, for that matter, right? Which is a simple computer, but is fundamentally distinct, say, from what's happening in a watch or what's happening with DNA, right? Because with that, you have a single physical interaction that is producing a single physical result, right? Which is
But the system as a whole, it doesn't only produce one result. The process of gene expression.
No, but I'm sorry. So this is the really important thing, is that what I'm saying here is that for any given singular input, there is only ever a single output, right?
Well,
one at a
so
time.
I type a J on my keyboard, and that outputs to a J visually on the screen.
Well, actually, so when you type a J in your keyboard, it only outputs a J on the screen because of all of the other active, currently stored data on the computer, right? If there was nothing else on the computer, you wouldn't do anything.
Yeah, but if there's no tRNAs, it's not going to produce an amino acid.
Right, but the thing is, and I think this is exactly the thing that I feel you're not getting, is that the tRNA, right, only needs to be there. If you only have one codon, right, you only need one anticodon, and you're done. You're fine. Okay? But for a computer, you need everything there. It's not enough to say that you have that little bit of code that receives the J, right? That won't work. You need to have the rest of the operating system. You need to have the rest of the code that does interpretation, the code that does display, everything else, right?
But we're just talking about different systems, though. I mean, you still have the code. They work in very different ways.
They work in very different ways.
But you still have code that's converted into different physical states.
The reason that one codon binds with one anticodon, right, is because of the specific physical chemistry, right? You could put a mutated tRNA, right, that has an affinity to different peptidyl transferases, right? In which case, it would produce a different result because the ribosome doesn't care. It doesn't care, and the tRNA doesn't care, and the codon doesn't care. The mRNA doesn't care. None of it knows the difference. Actually, the computer does care, because if you screw up with the computer, the whole thing will crash.
Well, but now you're talking about function. I mean, even if the computer crashes, it's still, translation still occurs.
Well, it doesn't. It fails to occur because the code doesn't work. You have a syntax error, right? I mean, this is...
Like, well, you end up with a non-functional protein.
No, you actually still end up with the protein, though. Right? You still have that protein product at the end because it doesn't know the difference. It still just produces the thing, right?
Yeah, but
this is the difference between... This is the thing that is distinct about chemistry, right? This is because it is all chemistry. There's... And this is why what I'm saying is...
You can say the same thing about a computer.
You really can't, though.
I think you can. Well, why not?
Well, because again, for the computer to work, requires the entirety of the system. And not just that it requires the entirety of the system, because you could say that the protein translation requires, it requires the tRNA and the codon and the ribosome, right? And that's true, right? But the difference is that for the computer to work, right, it needs all of the data at once, right? But for the protein to work, it only needs the codon anticodon to work.
See, I'm not sure I totally get what you're saying. It needs all of the data at once.
What I mean is that what?
Go ahead.
Well, so what I mean is that if you have a calculator, right, and you type in 11 plus 17, right, and you hit enter, hit equals, right, you get a very different result than if you typed in 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 7. It's the same numbers, different result. It has to be there at the same time. But with the protein, with the ribosome, you give it a particular codon, it binds with a particular anticodon, amino acid gets put on the end.
So a computer doesn't process information packets in sequence?
A computer processes packets. That's the point. It doesn't process bits. Processes packets.
Yeah,
processes
well, we're also
sets
talking
of
about
bits.
we're also talking about base pair triplets, not individual base pairs.
But again, the fact that you have 3 base pairs at once, that's just a single codon, and the only thing that matters is the codon, not the base pairs. And that is very different from the way a computer works.
That's a packet then.
No, it's not a packet, right? Because the packet, right, is the 1 or the 0. Not the 1 or the 0. It's the set of 1s and 0s, right? But with the amino acid, right? With the
topology.
Sorry.
I mean, it could just be analogous to a topology of codon or whatever.
What could be?
There's a series of 0s and 1s in a packet.
But the thing is, right, is that the constituents of the packet, right? It can hold various different things, right? And it can have various different outputs depending on the specific contents.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but the codon is just a codon. It's always just a single codon.
The constituent parts can change in a codon. You have different codons.
Not in any way that's relevant. If you have different base pairs, it's still a codon. It's still just a single codon.
Okay, so I still don't see the difference between that.
Well, the difference is
a packet of information.
The difference is that the computer is taking the entire packet of information and it's looking at each individual 1 and 0, and it's determining the appropriate way to put those 1s and 0s together to produce the output. The ribosome, the tRNA, the mRNA, doesn't do that at all. It's just, does it fit together? Yeah. Give us the next one.
But I feel like you're saying that these things are different, but it's not actually different.
I don't understand how you can possibly not see that as different.
A packet of 0s and 1s does something because of its arrangement or whatever. It's topology, quote unquote.
No, something is done to the packet.
Okay.
And it's interpreted to do that particular thing because the system that's doing it is able to specifically distinguish between different possibilities.
So the ribosome tRNAs, they don't distinguish between together. They don't distinguish between different codons.
They do not distinguish. No,
So
they either have the affinity or they do not.
So during gene expression, it's always going to be the same amino acid that comes up because you can't distinguish between different codons.
Again, it cannot distinguish between a particular codon and anticodon pair. However, the different possible pairs all have different forces applied on the ribosome, and only that minimalized force of the highest affinity binding allows for the ribosome to close. But it does not interpret, it just closes. The computer interprets.
It doesn't interpret, it just physically interacts, just like the ribosome.
Well, except that if you have any understanding of how logic gates work, right, then you understand that you have to have simultaneously signals at all these different points all at once, or the thing doesn't do what you want it to do. Right?
Okay.
Right, and so the arrangement of these logic gates, the arrangement of the signals, causes specific patterns of other logic gates to operate on other patterns of signals that also have to be there in the right arrangement to then produce varying output depending on the pre-existing arrangement of yet other signals and other logic gates, right? It's not just that one comes in, zero goes. You could say that. I'll give you the perfect example, right? So what a ribosome, what a tRNA, mRNA ribosome does, you could say is analogous to what a NOT gate does. Okay. Signal, no signal. No signal, signal. It's somewhat analogous to that. But the notion that it's analogous to an entire adder, for instance, much less something like a multiplexer or RAM or anything more complicated than just a NOT gate, which is the most fundamental thing, right? It's the most basic possible logic gate. Now, anything past that is not analogous.
Yeah, but I think we're comparing how these systems work, and I think, I already think that they work very differently, but
it is precisely these differences in how they work that marks the reason for the semantic distinguishing between the two, as one being applicable to communication theory and the other not.
So you don't see DNA as a message that is interpreted.
There's nothing with the capacity to interpret it in the way that is relevant to communication theory, which is the thing relevant to language.
So communication theory requires what that it lacks? It requires an interpreter?
It requires a system, an entity, with the capacity to essentially what it requires is storage, right? Like if you were to ask me to point to one thing, what does the interpreter need to do? It needs to store multiple distinct possible inputs and then act on them all at once.
See, that's the part I don't think. I don't feel like that's relevant. That it has to act on them all at once.
But
why is that relevant?
Like that's just what communication is. right? Like it's like what you were saying earlier, right? About how in the English language, right? We have certain vowels and consonant sounds, right?
Yeah, and I'm
But
hearing them in a linear sequence.
right, except that if you when I hear a word, right, I'm not acting on the simply on the linear sequence of these sounds. I'm acting on the specific entire combination of these sounds, right? Because if you were to put a big long pause between each of the syllables, right? Between each, not just the syllables, but between each of the sounds, it's more difficult to actually tell what somebody is saying versus if you get them all at once. Because the brain needs to actually interpret them all at once. It needs to have them together at the same time to interpret that message.
I don't think it's at the same time, though. I think it's still linear. You still receive it linearly.
Yes, you receive it in a linear fashion. Mm-hmm. You interpret it together.
You interpret it together. Well, sure.
And that's the difference.
Well, yeah, but the ribosome, the whole translation apparatus, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it produces proteins at the end.
Right, but it does it by getting a single message in.
Uh-huh.
Right, a single input in, a single output out. Doesn't take it all at once. Doesn't interpret it all at once. Doesn't interpret it at all, I would say, but that's neither here nor there. Right? Right, it's not like you're,
But my mind produces a word after I've received a linear sequence of vowels and consonants.
Yes, you've stored that linear sequence of vowels and consonants and interpreted them at once to produce a single output. Right? Because otherwise, you'd be getting the first sound in, right? And you'd interpret it right then and there. And you get the next sound in and you interpret that right then and there. And that's obviously not what we're doing. We're not Google's autocomplete, right? Like that's not what's happening.
I mean, we have memory.
Yes.
But I think the output is specified though too, in for DNA and the acids and proteins. So I think there's still specificity there, but still,
yes, there's certainly specificity. Yeah, that's sure. But again. So this is the thing. Again, what I'm trying to say is that you've got a video that's making a particular semantic point on a fine distinction in a particular branch of mathematics and statistics, right? And you're hearing that and you're saying that, well, that's just semantics. Well, that's the point, right?
No, I'm not saying it's just semantics. First thing I'm saying is...
Do you accept that there's a difference between communication theory of information and physical theory of information?
I understand that... I think it's a little gray to me. Some of the distinctions don't sound like real distinctions.
They are distinctions of semantics, right? That are important within the specific relevant fields. They may not seem important outside of those fields, but that's actually, I think, true of most semantic things, right?
Well, we can approach it another way. He's saying DNA isn't quote-unquote interpreted by anything in terms of like a mind, or what you're saying, all at once or whatever. I don't think anybody really argued that minds were responsible for what DNA does. So I would also kind of say it's sort of a straw man. I don't think anybody made that argument.
Right, but the thing is that when you're trying to say that it's a language, language is about communication. Okay, communication falls under communication theory, and so that's why this distinction is relevant, right? Because even though nobody is intentionally saying that it requires some mechanism of interpretation, that falls under saying that it's language, right? Because it's necessarily the case that for it to be a language, in that sense, for it to be a communication, in that sense, there must be an interpreter. And if there's no interpreter, then it's not a language in that sense.
I mean, I still don't really... I still don't really understand why you are saying the DNA isn't interpreted, except you're saying that it has to be... packets have to be interpreted all at once. I'm still not sure I even buy that, or buy that that's relevant. We might have to table that for now. But even... I mean, if somebody's saying DNA is a language, you can interpret that to mean that they're saying there are minds responsible for what DNA is doing, but I think that's an uncharitable interpretation of what anybody argues. I don't think any...
That's fair. I mean, it would be an uncharitable interpretation of somebody merely saying that it's interpreted for it to then be assumed that there must be a mind. However, if the argument is against it being interpreted, then whether or not there's a mind is sort of irrelevant, right? Because the point isn't whether or not there's a mind, the point is whether or not it's interpreted. Could be interpreted by mind or not, but if it's not interpreted, then it's not interpreted. And
I think it's synonymous in this video. If it's interpreted, then it's interpreted by a mind.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't... Like. I wouldn't agree with that understanding of communication theory, because certainly there are applications of communication theory outside of minds. Although I suppose you could argue that all of these applications involve minds in some sense, but that's not really the point. I mean, you can set up a computer system to just run in a sort of random fashion, communicating back and forth with itself, and it would still be communication as understood in communication theory, even though, like, humans could all be dead and gone, right, and all other minds dead and gone, and the system could still be communicating in the way that it is meant now by communication theory. So I don't think that a mind as such is required, but what is required is interpretation.
Well, hey, maybe you can provide me some sources on interpretation within communication theory.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get that. It's been a while since I've really gone into this.
We'll have to table that for next time, though. Let me go on to the last... Let's see here. Okay, the last couple of things here. So he's saying that it's an incredulity fallacy that DNA is language. By arguing DNA is language, you're committing an incredulity fallacy because you are incredulous that nature could do it. So here's that clip. Hold on a second. Alright, here we go.
And if one doesn't accept natural selection, then, well, they're committing the creationists' all-time favourite personal incredulity fallacy.
Oh,
They're asserting that natural selection is false because they don't personally understand how it works.
Okay, I don't think. So he's saying that natural selection is, again, the explanation, alternative to mind, for the existence of DNA or code or whatever. I think he actually sort of concedes that it's a lot like code, or is code. But I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think it's incredulity just because you don't believe something. I think he just hasn't argued the case for it. It's kind of. I mean, I don't know what word to say. It doesn't come across as harsh, but it seems lazy to me. I mean, if the whole crux of the argument is natural selection did it, why doesn't he make that argument? I mean, I'm not incredulous. I'm skeptical that he has the argument. I've watched a couple of his videos, and he keeps coming back to natural selection and talking about natural selection and just saying that it can do all these wonderful things, but he doesn't actually argue for it. So I'm actually kind of skeptical about what does he know about natural selection, because I haven't heard him say anything about it. And you can't just say that somebody's incredulous just because they don't accept your conclusion. Certainly not when you haven't made the argument. That said, I would be really interested to see what his argument is from natural selection. But he doesn't make it.
I haven't seen the entirety of this video. So, and I definitely haven't seen anything else that this guy's ever done. So,
yeah, he has a nice accent, though.
I can't really
sounds a lot better than me. Okay, so then the next thing is he claims that it's an argument from ignorance. So 6 minutes and 57 seconds. Okay, here we go.
Assertion that language is always a product of a mind is unsubstantiated. In fact, it's an argument from ignorance, and further still, it's an argument from ignorance that natural selection has completely demolished.
Okay, so
really quick though, I just want to say,
okay,
from what I just heard there, it seems responding to particular people, right?
Yeah.
And these particular people say that language is always the product of mind. And so in that context, it's sensible for him to treat minds as being necessary for communication, because that's what the people he's talking about are arguing for. Right?
I really don't think they're arguing for that.
I mean, I'm just saying that, like, the argument, that the thing that he's arguing against. Hold on 1 second, I'm having problems with my audio.
Okay.
I don't know if I fixed it or not. But,
I don't know. I hear you okay.
Sound sometimes has problems.
Yeah. Are you having problems hearing me? I hear you just fine.
I'm gonna have to switch my headphones over.
Okay. Alright, CRISPR is having some audio issues, which is too bad. We'll have to pick it up another time. Well, the last little clip there of the videos, he says that the argument from DNA is an argument from ignorance because it's unsubstantiated, he says. And I don't think that that's the case, because I think wherever we have digital code, which I do think that DNA is, it has come from an intelligent cause wherever we know the cause. So, agree or disagree with that. The structure of the argument is not an argument from ignorance. It is not saying we don't know where this came from, therefore an intelligent cause did it. It's saying we understand this particular pattern. This is a positive effect of intelligent cause. That's not an argument from ignorance. It's a positive argument from the evidence. So agree or disagree, that's fine, but you can't call it an argument from ignorance. It's just not the structure of the argument. So with that, I think we're going to call it for the night. Sadly, we lost CRISPR. I always enjoy discussing things with CRISPR. I always learn a lot of things. I think as far as communication theory and everything, it really hinges on the idea of interpretation. So I think that's something that we could probably clarify in a future hangout, maybe next week if I have time to research it. But we'll just see what happens. In the meantime, I'm gonna head out, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Bye.